Good afternoon. I'm here with my guest. I'm Doug Holder. I'm here with my guest, Cynthia Brackett-Vincent, and she's the publisher of the Rorion magazine over here, beautiful magazine, and the author of Questions About Home, her latest poetry collection. How many poetry collections
This
have
is
you?
only my second.
This is only your second one. And got a really nice review in the Boston area press, small press and poetry scene by Dennis Daly. So welcome, Cynthia. Came all the way down from Farmington, Maine.
Farmington, Maine.
Yes.
It's so good to be here with you.
Thank you. Cynthia Brackett, I'll just read a brief introduction, is a Pushcart Prize nominee. She has published, edited the Rorion, a poetry journal, since 1995, and has over 100 of her own poetry poems plus nonfictions published in the United States and abroad. Her 2002 co-edited anthology, Woman on Poetry, Writing, Revising, Publishing, and Teaching, was named one of the 100 best books for writers by poets and writers. Cynthia holds an AA in Social Sciences from Quincy College, a BFA in Creative Writing from the University of Maine in Farmington, and will earn an MA in Creative Writing from Poetry at Southern New Hampshire University in 2015. She lives in Maine with her husband, 3 cats, and she enjoys hiking and snowshoeing, etc. So thank you, and our website is www.encirclepub, ENCIRCLE pub.com. So I was going to ask you, and we have a long history because in 1998, when we started the Ibbotson Street Press here in Somerville, I asked you for advice. I guess you had published me early on some of my poetry.
Well, I started the Rorion in 1995,
So yeah, and so you had been in business for a little while, and I asked you for advice, and you came to our first party on Ibbotson Street, if I remember.
that.
How did you guys start out? Maybe you could tell us the Rorion, and how have you changed over the years? Because there's been a lot of change too.
That's a great question. Well, I suppose the major change is that we began in Massachusetts and now we're in Maine. But we'll always be a New England poetry journal with our focus on New England poetry. But I think, as you know from Ibbotson Street, the change is how your magazine evolves. When I first started taking submissions, I asked anyone I knew. I begged my creative writing professors, I begged fellow students, and that's how I got my first submissions. And then once I listed in Poets Market and other directories, work started coming from all over the world. So it just evolves, and it's amazing. And the other change is that I do the glossy cover now with a photo. And we used to use a little piece of clip art for each one. And that's only an aesthetic issue. But we also take, as we were talking about earlier, we take submissions online now. So I think that reaches a broader audience because it's so easy to do.
And you were, as we were discussing before the show, you were a little hesitant to do that.
Well, I was, and I remember when I was here, one of the thing that I looked forward to the most was going to the post office and picking up my mail. And I've always told myself when I'm...
Well, you still get mail, right?
I do, but I don't usually pick it up. So
okay.
I've always told myself when I get tired of seeing the mail that comes in, then I'll stop. So.
Okay.
But I'm still going.
All right.
I'm still going.
And you have... now, you're sort of like the Christian Science monitor in the sense that a lot of poetry is nature, and also you don't like things that are too dark. What's your philosophy about that?
Well, the name, the Rorion, luminescent, like the dawn. I think when I first started, there were a lot of magazines that sort of ranted to rant. And that was sort of the time period that was happening at the time. So I sought to do something a little more inspirational, but I really mean an inclusionary focus with that. Inspirational, meditational, a little different, something that can lift people up.
Okay, I think we all need that, especially in these times.
And it's not that I don't, there are a lot of poems that I liked that were darker than we sort of evolved to be, and that's why we started the
broadsheet. And tell us a bit about the Rorion.
The Rorion is a broadsheet, and I just decided that there were a lot of longer poems, darker poems, more experimental poems that just wouldn't fit our format or normally what we publish. So I started that, and it comes out twice a year. And Devin McGuire does that now. He's my assistant editor with the Rorion, and he's taken it to a whole new level.
Good. Is it always going to stay a broadsheet?
We talk about that. For now, I think it will, but we sort of bat that back and forth whether we should do a journal, but people like the broadsheet.
Yeah, something to be said for broadsheets. I know that the Rorion, I was going to ask you about that. Now, I love cats, and I love your poem, How to Love a Cat, which is in your new collection, Questions About Home. In a way, isn't it a way you love a cat sort of like you might love a man or a woman if you're, whatever? And what do you think, in some ways?
That's a good...
I mean, there was a sort of way you talked about, what page was that on again?
Very good question. I wrote this for my cat Panoptes, and of course my cats are all named after Greek figures. It's on page 21, but I think so. I mean, we talk about our kitties as our children, even though we have grown children and grandchildren. But they do become part of the family, like they're family members.
And cats why are cats a source of fascination? I know Lynn Lishman loves cats. You
I didn't
published
know
Lynn
that.
Lishman.
I have.
A lot of poets, Marge Piercy is a big cat woman. What is it about cats, you think?
I love dogs too, but cats, well, they're easier. They sort of have their own mind, and I think they're very intuitive. I remember when I was sick with Lyme disease and we didn't know what it was, my cat Poseidon, he would never sit on my lap, never. He was always my husband's kitty. And there was one day when I had just had enough, and I was sitting on the couch and I was in tears. He came and sat on my lap, and I think they're intuitive that way.
Yeah, I think they really are.
Yeah.
I remember reading about a cat that was in a nursing home that would know when someone was in really bad shape, and it would go and sit with them. And, cats are intuitive. If you've never had a cat, you'd find out quickly.
And as you see too in here, I love my German Shepherd, and I love dogs.
Yeah, I'm not much of a dog person. I love cats, but I don't hold anything against people who do.
Well, that's good.
You co-edited Woman on Writing, Editing, Publishing, Teaching. Why do you think this book needs to be written? I mean, aren't there a plethora of books written on this subject of teaching, writing, publishing, editing? Why do you think this book needed to be done?
I think the focus on women writing, publishing, and teaching. And I have it over here, but in my introduction, I think what's important is that in general, it's harder for women to get published. If you look at it's what is it called? It is a survey of editors and their favorite poets in Dust Books directories.
Yeah.
The list is 10 or 12 people each time, every couple of years, and usually the great majority is men. And I think it's important that women can get published.
Because I was just interviewing Susan Tepper, who's going to be coming here. You know Susan Tepper?
I don't.
She's a novelist, and she's coming here to Somerville to read at the Savannah Barbara Press. You know Gloria?
Oh yes.
And but she told me, and I asked her about women in publishing, and they're still getting the shaft, so to speak. And she said she didn't think so. She says it wasn't her experience. She said that she thinks the problem with a lot of women is that they won't. Women writers is that they won't. They just write about traditional things, children, love relationships. So they won't go be as adventurous as men. Do you think that's?
I don't think.
And he says that you have to do that. Go out of your comfort zone.
I think you do have to go out of your comfort zone, but I also think that there's a market for everything. If you write about traditional, the home life or whatever, there's always a market for it, and I don't think people realize how easy it is to narrow down places to send your work to. And you can do that through Poets Market or any other directory.
Anyone who read your book, Questions About Home, would realize that you're infatuated with the state of Maine. And you live in Plymouth, which is pretty nice too. It's nice to read down there.
Plymouth is very nice. Yep.
So what is it about Maine that really made?
Well,
why did you move to Maine in the
It's
first
funny,
place?
my youngest son, we moved to Maine in 2002. My husband is from Falmouth, Mass, and I grew up in Plymouth. And it was his job that made us move. Basically, stay employed or not. So we moved to Waterville. His job was moved to Waterville, Maine. And we had always talked about moving north after the kids grew up. But because we like to hike and we've always enjoyed the White Mountains, we thought it would be New Hampshire. And so when it happened to be Maine, it was a shock, but it was just something that it was sort of an adventure. And as the title poem suggests,
The title poem being
Questions About Home.
Questions about home.
The Pantoum.
What is a pantoum for people?
A pantoum, well, a pantoum traditionally, it started, I should say that modern poets write pantoums they're always been in 4-line stanzas, and there's 2 repeating lines, and a lot of times the last line is also the first line of the pantoum. But the important thing about the pantoum form is that it's able to bring home a point because of the repetition. And
it's rhyming.
It doesn't have to rhyme.
All right, but
no.
it has. It's metered.
No.
No meter.
No.
Okay, it's just repetition.
It's just the 4 lines and the repetition.
But it's a form poem, though.
Yes, it's a form.
Do you ever think that you're ever sort of limited by a form poem as opposed to free verse?
I write mostly in free verse.
Okay.
And so I have an unrhymed sonnet in here.
Mm-hmm.
I have a tanka in here, and the pantoum. But I've never really been able to master form in certain senses metrically, because I can spot a certain poem, but to write it myself, I do feel like the form gets in the way, and I feel like the form masters the content sometimes.
All right, so getting back to Farmington, Maine, and why you love Maine and all that.
As the poem says, I feel like, my grandfather lived in a rural town near Plymouth, which was Plimpton. And we used to go there, and my father would take us places there where he spent a lot of time as a boy. And before we saw our property in Maine, when we drove down that road, I knew that was the place. I hadn't seen the house, the land, anything. I just knew that that's where I was meant to be.
And what is it about Maine?
It's a connection with nature.
But you didn't have that in Plymouth.
I did. I had the ocean, not a lot of woods. We played in the woods when we were growing up, but it's the forest. It's the forest, the old stone walls.
It's not as populated, is it?
Not at all.
But I hear it's an artsy town, Farmington, kind of.
Well, Farmington has the University of Maine at Farmington, so Farmington's an artsy town, and we live in a tiny town right next to Farmington. But because...
And it's a hell of a lot cheaper than here.
Oh my God, I can't even tell you.
Yeah.
My son lives in our house in Massachusetts and is going to buy it soon. But the price difference is just incredible. The cost of living, most everything's about the same, but the land is unbelievably expensive. They say if you pay over $500 an acre, you're paying too much.
So it's cheaper up there, right?
Yes.
And even get an
Yes.
apartment or something in Farmington, it's...
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There's 1,200 people in our tiny town. I think there's about 7,000, and it fluctuates obviously with student population. But this is a funny story, when I went to visit my son, who lived in Glendale, Arizona for a while, there were 1,200 people in his apartment complex.
Wow. So it's a small...
Yes.
So, and it's an artsy community there. What's going on up there?
Well, they do have a lot of readings because of the creative writing program there that I had no idea existed, and I just lucked into when I moved up there. So they have visiting writers. There's a great local independent bookstore there that...
What's the name of it?
Devaney, Doak and Garrett. And they have a lot of poetry readings, fiction, nonfiction.
How far is Farmington from here?
From here, about 3.5 hours.
So it's pretty far up there.
When I drive, because like I said, all my children still live here, and thus grandchildren, it's about a little over 4 hours.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so you love the wilderness, and one of your grandkids asked a very interesting question I was reading about. It actually says, "What does poetry mean?" So, what did you say to him?
I was wondering if you would ask me that because, in the basic sense, how do you explain that to a 6-year-old is the question. Mm-hmm. And so I had to take a book that he had and show him how the line of the paragraph went out to the edge of the page. And I said, in poetry, the lines are shorter. But that's really what separates poetry from prose if you don't consider prose poems. But in reality, there's so much more. You can't say to a 6-year-old, well, it uses figurative language, or it's, you can tell him it's shorter than usual in writing. But you can't tell him it's concise because he's 6.
Unless he's, a prodigy, right? Yeah.
He's so smart.
Yeah.
And he wrote a poem, I think it was in 1st grade, and he was so proud of it. He called me, my daughter-in-law had called us up and had him read it to us. So.
And in fact, you're a teacher too, right? You do teach?
Well, before I got sick with Lyme disease, and after I graduated from the University of Maine at Farmington, I worked in the adult education system, so I taught poetry. I taught poetry writing workshops, and there were also people in there who were just taking it as an elective toward their high school diploma. But mostly it was a group of people who just decided they might like to write poetry. And recently I just got finished doing a class for the University of Maine's program, their senior college. So it's the University of Maine at Farmington's is called Gold Leaf. And each University of Maine college has their own senior college. So I taught a 6-week
For
program.
senior citizens?
For over 50.
Oh, okay.
Over 50.
Okay.
I hate to think of myself as a senior citizen,
Yeah,
but
I don't like that.
I guess we are.
We are.
And that was really great. It was sort of the same thing. I used, of course I added new things as I go, but I used basically the same 3 concepts, and it's inspiration. Staying inspired is a big thing. And then the nuts and bolts of writing poetry. And then how to get your work seen by other people. So
Okay, so
I taught a 15-week class through the adult education system, and then I was sort of forced to break it down into 6 hour-and-a-half sessions. So I had to take a lot out, but
okay.
yeah.
And what do you plan to do once you get your MFA?
MA.
MA.
And I decided to get my MA instead of my MFA because I've taken so many workshop-type classes that I feel like I sort of missed a lot of the lit background that you get if you got...
But the MFA, isn't that more
It's
for jobs? It's better for teaching jobs? I mean, I have an MA myself.
Possibly. But I think with my publication history and things like
Right.
that it won't be too hard. But I really felt like I was missing the lit background, the global lit background, the British lit background. It's not that
Right.
I didn't take those classes,
Well,
but
that exactly was my thinking too.
yes.
I got an MA in literature.
And I didn't want to go in and not know much about Shakespeare.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
I studied him in a survey class for my bachelor's, but I really didn't do it intensely.
Right.
So.
Okay, now I'd like you to read for the next 10 minutes or so from your work.
Okay.
And whatever you choose, okay?
Well, I think I will. Well, I want to say first, Doug, that your blurb on the back really nailed it in the first line. This collection
Oh, thank you.
is really a love poem to me.
Uh-huh.
It was important to me to get a blurb from someone like you, someone really interested and involved in the poetry scene, but from Massachusetts, where I started,
Okay.
and from a Maine poet, and then from someone outside our New England world.
Okay.
One poem that I thought would be really interesting to read here, because it sort of chronicles what we do. My husband and I, we travel back and forth a lot, and to see the grandchildren and children. And I don't know how many trips we've made back and forth since 2012, but here's one.
Okay.
And Boston is in here.
Okay.
It's called "My Husband Drives Our Midnight Blue Jeep at Dusk." And a lot of these poems, the first line also serves as the title. My husband drives our midnight blue Jeep at dusk on Route 3. Lights shimmer ahead in the Prue, the Hancock. The Pine Street Inn watches us go by. We head down into the O'Neill, and I think of my uncle driving me north for holidays. His smile, him telling me to duck down as we went into the tunnel. Eddie Lane jumps a quick left before we emerge, straight shot onto the Zachem. Centrifugal force swings us around the arc of the toward the shaky Tobin. The old green hunchback propels us as we descend, head start onto Route 1. I try to look into the windows of Chelsea, Revere, but can't hold any in view along this concrete corridor. Soon it's all stores, strip clubs, gas stations, donut shops, malls, motels. At 95 North, he blinks a right. We pass the exit to my mother's cemetery, my uncle's house. The ghosts of Danvers State Hospital play in the near dark on the hill. I lay back the seat at the 39 miles to Portsmouth sign. Route 1 keeps whooshing in my head. I feel the Jeep slow. The cold air swirls in when his window goes down. He mumbles a thank you at the Hampton tolls. Maine border so close now. I wait, eyes closed, until the Piscataqua takes us up, over, down, leaves our old lives south in the night wind. Next thing I know, we're over the Androscoggin, over the Cabo those silvery, watery veins in Maine's dark night. I remind him to watch out for deer, for moose. An hour later, it's the familiar frost heaves of our dirt road. I scooch up in my seat to find 4 stars in our headlights, 2 young deer. The pair walks the road ahead of us like guides, too small to jump the late March snowbanks. First chance they get, they bolt. Inside, our cats rub up against our legs as if to say, don't leave us again.
Okay.
And the title poem,
Okay.
The Pantoum. Questions about home. When are you moving home, I am asked. In turn, I say, have you heard the loon call? Have you seen scrape marks of a glacier's teeth? Cars whiz by their homes, their kids, lightning speed. In turn, I say, have you heard the loon call? Is where you're from necessarily home? Cars whiz by their homes, their kids, lightning speed. Blackberries ripen, we watch, wait for deer. Is where you're from necessarily home? Home is where your soul finally sees it. Blackberries ripen, we watch, wait for deer. Why Maine? What on earth made you move there? Home is where your soul finally sees it. I saw the woods like my father showed me. Why Maine? What on earth made you move there? The luminescent stars calling us home.
Nice.
The first section is really a love poem.
A lot
to
of
me.
poems about your father in there also.
Yes, and I was thinking maybe I will read one.
Well, how was your relationship with your father? You seem very close.
Well, we were close, and my father had polio, as you'll see in the poem. And then when I left the religion that he had brought us up in,
Which was?
a Jehovah's Witness, they don't speak to you anymore, so I lost that relationship.
Oh.
But then when he was ill the last 6 months, he found it in his heart to let me back in his life. And
So like the Hasidic Jews, if you leave the religion.
Yep, they don't acknowledge your existence at all, even family. Yep. So
Let's hear a poem
it's
about it.
difficult.
Okay.
So this is my father when I was younger. Young.
Yeah.
Not last year, but a lot younger. It's called How It Was That He Laughed Still. His stories, his father's stories, how he loved each more and more with each telling, how polio offered my father the luxury of rumination, as my sister and I sat, one at his side, one at the foot of his bed, how he laughed in the incomplete way, being paralyzed aloud. Sometimes I'd stare at the ring embossed into the skin of his thin neck, reminder of 2 years in an iron lung. I'd wonder how it was that he laughed still, how he wanted to tell us stories each night, while our mother only swept around us now in wide circles, calling from the distant kitchen when supper was done.
Is your mother still alive?
She's not. She died. She passed away a few months before my dad did.
Oh.
Yep. And
Happens that way.
it does
Yeah.
a lot. Yep. My parents were married in '53, and my dad got polio in '55, and I was born in '57. So I don't remember my dad as, in the pictures I see, robust and healthy, and my parents really happy. So that's why I wrote this poem. And the first line is the title. If only I could imagine them always. If only I could imagine them always this way. My father, perched high on the roof, sundown at his back. Coffee steams from an open thermos. His attention for the briefest moment each evening lost on a young woman with black hair and her red plaid coat as it tosses in the wind when she leaves through the Salem factory gate. This, the good morning of the watchman's nights. They met at Parker Games in Salem. Yeah.
There was a factory for Parker?
In Salem, yeah, a big one. Yeah, she was a secretary and he a night watchman. Yeah. How much time do I have left?
Just, keep going. I think you have about 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Well then, I will need to choose wisely. I can't read 5 grandchildren poems, so I won't read any. But there are poems in here for each one of them. And there are poems about going to try to find a diagnosis for my Lyme disease, which I'm happy to say I'm recovered from.
Great.
But I will read one about my mother.
Okay.
And this is a relatively new one. Some days you just want to sit outside, smoke a cigarette, and have iced coffee with your mom. But you don't smoke, and your mom has passed, so you sit on the steps drinking blueberry tea, thinking about her. You're used to thinking about her in all the old ways, how you always had to take care of her, how she constantly yelled at your helpless dad. But the more you sit and think, the more you remember the little things she did. You want her to walk to your house and make you cinnamon toast, take care of the boys, pour Downy into the washing machine. She'd be at a loss about your diagnosis, and all she'd be able to say would be, "Don't overdo it now." But I'd overdo it. I'd take her out to lunch, slip a few dollars into her purse, buy her and Daddy a lobster roll for supper, give her a ride back to Phoenix Court, say how good the laundry smells now, and thanks for her help.
Thank you very much, Cynthia.
Thank you, Doug. This was much fun.
Just